When Christianity emerged in the first century, it entered a world governed by empire and stratified by class, gender, and status. In the Roman Empire, unwanted infants were often left to die, gladiatorial combat to the death served as public entertainment, and the paterfamilias held absolute power over his household. Mercy and humility were typically seen as weaknesses, not virtues. Into this context came a small, seemingly insignificant movement of Jesus' followers preaching a revolutionary idea, that every human being is made in the image of God and loved by the Creator, and that a new way of life centered on love, service, and human dignity was at hand. Over the next 2 millennia, that movement grew and spread across continents. In the process, it helped transform cultures and institutions in profound ways. Today, many of the values and institutions that underpin human flourishing, from the equal worth of every person, to education for the masses, to hospitals caring for the sick, to concepts of human rights and representative government, trace a significant part of their lineage to the influence of Christianity. It is a bold claim, but one increasingly supported by historical evidence. Christianity's impact on civilization has overwhelmingly been a force for good and for human flourishing. This does not deny that Christians, being fallible humans, have sometimes fallen short of their faith's ideals. However, when we survey the broad sweep of history, Christian contributions stand out in sector after sector of society. As historian Thomas Kidd succinctly observed, Christianity is arguably the greatest engine of moral reform and cultural riches that the world has known. In other words, the Christian faith has been a driving factor behind some of the most important improvements in human well-being and social progress across history. These conclusions are echoed by various scholars. Even a sociologist like Robert Woodbury, through quantitative historical analysis, found that the presence of Christian missionaries correlates strongly with positive outcomes in societies, including higher literacy, better health, and the development of democratic institutions. In this lecture, we will systematically explore the contributions of Christianity to human flourishing from the 1st century through the 21st, focusing on 7 key domains. We will begin by examining Christianity's understanding of the human person, a moral anthropology grounded in the concept of the image of God, and how that elevated human dignity. Next, we'll look at Christianity's role in the development of education and intellectual life. From there, we will consider Christianity's influence on the rise of modern science and technology through its view of an ordered creation. We will then discuss how Christian compassion translated into institutions of charity, healthcare, and the relief of suffering. Building on that, we'll review Christianity's imprint on law, justice, and the genesis of human rights. We will also cover Christian contributions to political order and civic freedom, including ideas of governance and liberty. Finally, we will turn to the global impact of Christian mission and how the faith's expansion around the world has spurred social transformation in diverse cultures. Through each of these 7 lenses, our goal is to understand not only the historical facts, but the underlying principles, the theological convictions, and moral vision that propelled these contributions. Let us begin with the most fundamental idea in the Christian worldview, the nature and value of the human person made in the image of God. This doctrine of the Imago Dei, image of God, lies at the heart of Christian moral anthropology, the understanding of who we are as human beings and how we should treat one another. Moral anthropology and the image of God. Christianity teaches that every person is created in God's image. This idea, first expressed in Genesis, was revolutionary in the ancient world. If all men and women bear God's image, then in a profound sense all are equal in value, possessing inherent dignity, regardless of social status, ethnicity, or gender. The early Christians embraced this belief and lived it out in ways that gradually but decisively challenged the brutal social norms of their time. Unlike the prevailing Greco-Roman view, which ranked people by status and allowed the strong to dominate the weak, The Christian view asserted a moral equality among humans before God. A slave, a beggar, a foreigner, or a newborn child, all were to be regarded as neighbors and fellow image bearers, worthy of care and respect. This was a radical departure from classical attitudes, and it introduced a moral outlook that underlies many of our modern concepts of universal human rights and dignity. In practical terms, the early Christian community's commitment to the sanctity and equal worth of every life led to concrete actions that set them apart. In Roman society, for instance, it was common for unwanted infants, especially baby girls or those born with disabilities, to be abandoned to die of exposure. This practice was not illegal. It was an accepted, if tragic, way to manage family size or unwanted births. Christians, however, roundly condemned infanticide. They frequently went out to rescue exposed infants, especially baby girls left in the elements, bringing them into their own families or forming the earliest orphanages. From the earliest documents of the Church, such as the late 1st century Didache, we see prohibitions against both abortion and the killing of infants. To the Christians, each of those little abandoned children was made in God's image and therefore infinitely precious. The same ethic applied to those on society's margins, the poor, the disabled, the sick, and the elderly. The Church quickly gained a reputation for valuing and caring for people whom the rest of society had largely cast aside. Christian congregations supported poor widows who had no family, gave food and burial to the destitute, and even bought the freedom of slaves. In an empire notorious for its harshness and stratified indifference, such behavior was striking. The pagan emperor Julian, observing Christian benevolence in the 4th century, famously lamented that the impious Galileans support not only their own poor, but ours as well, shaming his fellow pagans. This Christian view of human worth didn't remain a private sentiment. It began to influence laws and social norms as Christianity spread. By the 4th century, when Christians rose to positions of influence in the Roman Empire, we find emperors enacting reforms explicitly rooted in the idea of each person's God-given value. Emperor Constantine, after embracing Christianity, instituted laws reflecting a new concern for human dignity. He outlawed branding a criminal's face, explaining that the human face reflects God's image and should not be disfigured even in punishment. He also abolished the practice of crucifixion as a form of execution, a significant reform in an empire that had used crucifixion to terrorize slaves and lower classes. Constantine and his successors made it easier for masters to free slaves and prohibited separating slave families during sales, small steps driven by the notion that even those in bondage had human worth. They took measures to protect children, for example, providing state support for destitute families so they would not feel compelled to abandon infants, and punishing kidnappers and child traffickers. Such humane legislation, virtually unheard of in earlier Roman law, was directly inspired by Christian ethics. The weak and vulnerable were to be protected, not exploited or discarded, a principle that gradually became embedded in Western legal tradition. At the heart of this cultural shift was the conviction that in God's eyes, every human life, regardless of age, ability, or social station, has sacred worth. That conviction slowly chipped away at many entrenched cruelties. Consider the institution of the gladiatorial games, where enslaved combatants fought to the death for entertainment. For centuries, these games were immensely popular. Yet Christian leaders consistently denounced the gladiatorial spectacle as murder and an affront to the value of human life. According to later historical accounts, a dramatic incident helped end the games. In AD 404, a monk named Telemachus traveled to Rome and during a gladiatorial bout leapt into the arena, pleading for the carnage to stop. The enraged crowd stoned him to death on the spot. But Emperor Honorius, hearing of this courageous martyrdom, is said to have been so moved that he banned gladiatorial combat shortly thereafter. Whether this account is embellished or not, it is clear that by the early 5th century, the ethos of the empire had changed. The idea of killing people for sport had become morally abhorrent under the influence of Christian teaching that even the lowest person's life has worth. Christian moral anthropology also gradually elevated the status of women. In the Roman world, women were often treated as second class. A daughter's life was literally in her father's hands at birth, and women had few rights in marriage or public life. Christianity, from its inception, taught a radical spiritual equality. As the Apostle Paul wrote, "There is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." Women were active in the early church as patrons, prophets, teachers, and martyrs. The Christian emphasis on marital fidelity and monogamy protected women from some of the worst Greco-Roman abuses. Roman law allowed men wide latitude in extramarital pursuits, while punishing unchastity harshly in women. Christianity, by contrast, called both husbands and wives to the same standard of fidelity. Husbands were urged to love their wives as Christ loved the church, a high ideal that implied gentleness, service, and mutual respect in marriage. Over time, these teachings translated into greater security and dignity for women. The practice of infanticide, which disproportionately affected female infants, was outlawed. The church provided support for widows who would otherwise be destitute or forced into undesirable remarriage. It also quietly undermined practices like arranged child marriages by teaching that valid marriage required the free consent of both bride and groom before God. Though true legal equality for women was still many centuries away, the groundwork was laid by the Christian notion that women and men share equally in God's image and grace. Another key element of Christian anthropology was the belief in universal moral accountability, the idea that all people, including rulers, are answerable to God's moral law. In classical antiquity, might often made right, and emperors were laws unto themselves. But Christianity introduced a moral check. It insisted that even the powerful were under a higher lawgiver. The Bible's prophets confronted kings when they did wrong, and the early church fathers carried on that tradition. In AD 390, for example, Bishop Ambrose of Milan famously reprimanded Emperor Theodosius for a massacre he had ordered and barred him from communion until he publicly repented. This was astonishing in a world where emperors had rarely, if ever, been held to account by anyone. It sent a clear message: no one is above God's justice. This Christian principle, that all individuals, from peasant to prince, are judged by the same divine standards, sowed seeds for later ideas, like the rule of law and constitutional limits on authority. Augustine would later articulate that an unjust law is no law at all, echoing a sentiment that would profoundly influence Western legal philosophy. In short, the Christian understanding of humanity provided both a higher estimation of human worth and a sobering realism about human fallibility, the doctrine of sin, which together suggested that society should uplift the lowly and also hold the mighty accountable. In sum, Christianity's first great contribution was to raise the perceived value of every human life. Through doctrine and deed, it challenged a world of cruelty and inequality with the proclamation that each person, slave or free, male or female, infant or elderly, bears God's image and is loved by Him. That conviction, lived out by the early church, slowly revolutionized cultural norms. It led to the saving of discarded children, the care of the destitute, the curbing of blood sports and brutal punishments, and the initial recognition of universal moral duties. The sanctity of life and the idea of fundamental human equality, which we now consider cornerstone principles of civilization, entered history on the back of these Christian beliefs. This anthropological foundation set the stage for further advancements in other domains. For once you accept that every person has inherent worth, it follows that you will seek to educate that person, to care for that person's well-being, and to include that person in the life of the community. And that is exactly what Christians endeavored to do: education and intellectual formation. A faith that regards every individual as precious before God naturally values the development of each person's mind. Christianity from its earliest days was a bookish faith, centered on the teachings of Scripture, and thus it placed a premium on reading, learning, and transmitting knowledge. It is no exaggeration to say that Christianity created a culture of literacy and learning that became one of its most enduring legacies. In the chaotic centuries after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, classical learning and literacy almost vanished in Europe. It was the Christian monasteries that kept the flame of knowledge alive. Monks across Europe diligently preserved not only the scriptures, but also the literary treasures of antiquity. In their scriptoria, writing rooms, they painstakingly copied manuscripts of the Bible, church writings, and even pagan Greek and Roman literature. Thanks to these faithful scribes, works of Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Virgil, and many others survived and were eventually reintroduced to wider readership. Secular historians often credit the medieval church, especially monastic communities in places like Ireland and Britain, with saving civilization by preserving books that would otherwise have been lost. This labor of love was motivated by the Christian belief that truth and wisdom are valuable, and that the human mind is a gift from God to be cultivated, not wasted. The conviction that God is a God of truth made the pursuit of knowledge a form of devotion. Christians did not merely preserve old knowledge, they actively built new institutions of learning. By the early Middle Ages, cathedral schools had sprung up in cities, and monasteries were educating not only future monks, but also local boys in basic letters. Perhaps the most famous early champion of Christian education was the Frankish king Charlemagne in the late 8th and early 9th centuries. Advised by his clerical friend Alcuin of York, Charlemagne decreed that every cathedral and major monastery should establish a school to teach reading, writing, arithmetic, music, and Bible knowledge. This initiative, sometimes called the Carolingian Renaissance, revived learning after a long dark period. It produced a more literate clergy and even a rudimentary educated laity. The very notion of schooling as something that should be available broadly and not just to a tiny elite took root under Charlemagne's reforms, explicitly because he saw knowledge of Scripture and wise governance as vital to a Christian realm. The single greatest contribution of Christianity to intellectual formation, however, was the invention of the university. The university system as we know it, an institution of higher learning granting degrees in multiple disciplines, arose in medieval Christian Europe and nowhere else. By the 12th and 13th centuries, Europe saw the emergence of universities in cities like Bologna, which specialized in law, Paris, especially noted for theology and philosophy, Oxford and Cambridge in England, and later others. These grew out of Christian cathedral schools and monastic schools that expanded and organized into guilds of scholars. The Church granted charters and protections to these early universities, giving them the freedom to inquire and teach. Theology was the central subject, often called the Queen of the Sciences, but the curriculum also included the liberal arts, literature, logic, mathematics, astronomy, music, and more, all taught under the premise that God created an orderly world that could be understood through reason. The very concept of a university, a community of masters and students seeking truth across disciplines, is deeply rooted in a Christian worldview that sees all truth as unified under God. As historian Vishal Mangalwadi notes, no other religious or cultural tradition produced an institution quite like the European university. It was Christianity's synthesis of faith and reason, its confidence that God's world is intelligible, and that studying creation honors the Creator, that gave birth to the university model, which would eventually spread around the globe. Institutions like Paris and Oxford produced generations of scholars, including luminaries like Thomas Aquinas, who not only deepened Christian theology, but also preserved and expanded knowledge in philosophy, law, and natural science, laying the groundwork for future intellectual revolutions. Equally significant was Christianity's commitment to educating not just a clerical elite, but ordinary people, including those of low status and, importantly, women. In most ancient cultures, education was reserved for wealthy males. Christianity did not transform that overnight, but it introduced a powerful impetus for mass education, the belief that everyone should have access to the Bible. After the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, this impetus exploded. Reformers like Martin Luther insisted that all believers must be able to read the scriptures for themselves. Luther, in his passionate appeal to German cities to establish schools, argued that it was the duty of every town to ensure that children, boys and girls alike, learned to read. He maintained that God would bless the establishment of schools, because through them, people could come to know His Word. The result was a remarkable increase in literacy wherever Protestantism spread. By the 17th century, Protestant regions of Europe had significantly higher literacy rates than their Catholic counterparts. Not because Catholics opposed education, they did not, but because Protestants were especially fervent about getting every child to read the Bible. In Lutheran Scandinavia, for example, pastors would not approve someone for confirmation until they could read, creating near-universal literacy by the 18th century. In Puritan New England, early laws like the Massachusetts Old Deluder Satan Act of 1647 mandated public schools so that Old Deluder Satan could not keep people in ignorance of the scriptures. Yale historian Sidney Alstrom quipped that New Englanders founded Harvard College in 1636, only 6 years after landing, when their huts were barely furnished, showing how vital education was to these Christian settlers. Beyond religious instruction, Christian-driven education eventually encompassed all fields of knowledge. The Church and later Christian philanthropists founded many of the great universities in Europe and the Americas. To give a few examples, nearly all of the oldest universities in England, Germany, and the American colonies began as explicitly Christian institutions to train clergy and inculcate a biblical worldview, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and Oxford among them. Even when the Enlightenment secularized many curricula, the structural legacy remained. Furthermore, Christian religious orders, like the Jesuits in the Catholic tradition, became renowned educators worldwide, establishing hundreds of quality schools and colleges from the 1500s onward. By the 19th and 20th centuries, Christian missionaries took the cause of education global. Wherever missionaries went, they started schools. In many parts of Africa and Asia, the first formal Western-style schools were those opened by missionaries. They taught not only the Bible, but reading, writing, arithmetic, and trades. Significantly, they often educated girls, which was revolutionary in cultures that typically did not school females. In India, for example, pioneers like Hannah Marshman in Serampore and later Pandita Ramabai, an Indian Christian woman, opened schools for girls, overcoming great social resistance. Throughout the world, the expansion of female education, which is strongly correlated with better societal outcomes, is tied to Christian mission activity. By around 1900, an enormous portion of the world's literacy and educational infrastructure was a result of missionary labor. Those mission schools produced many of the leaders of emerging post-colonial nations in the 20th century, people who combined traditional heritage with modern knowledge imparted by Christian teachers. In summary, Christianity contributed to education in 3 monumental ways: preserving knowledge through the Dark Ages, institutionalizing knowledge in the university, and democratizing knowledge by promoting literacy and schooling for all. A faith that honored God as the ultimate truth could do no less. The cumulative effect has been an educated global populace to an extent never imagined in pre-Christian times. Modern civilization's entire intellectual landscape, our universities, our widespread literacy, our ethos of educating every child, owes an immense debt to the influence of Christianity. When we speak of a knowledge-based society today, we are echoing values introduced by a faith that saw learning as a godly pursuit and ignorance as something to be overcome in the light of God's truth.